this class, which is also simultaneously a public lecture, is part of a week-long consideration of science that the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, which I, Steve Walsh, run here at Texas Tech. We're doing something unusual in the academic world. We're putting a whole week aside for a whole variety of events, looking at the phenomena of science from a variety of disciplinary angles. Today it's going to be sociology as a social science. We've had earlier talks on science and music, on ancient Greek science, on science fiction, on science and testability, and on, leaving one out, technology and the Industrial Revolution. And in addition to that, we have a distinguished visitor to campus, Professor Peter Deere of Cornell, historian of science, very, very well-known historian of science, who gave a lecture yesterday called "What is the Scientific?" Who cares? Who cares about the scientific revolution? By the way, all of these things will be eventually posted on our institute website. And he's with us today here in the class, and we'll say a few words after Professor Maloney has finished her talk. So I just want to thank you all for being here, whether you're students in the class, members of the community, other members of the faculty, husbands, whatever has brought you here. I want to give you my thanks. Also want to thank the CH Foundation, which is the guiding financial angel behind all of this, and without which it would not be possible. So, let me now turn the floor over to the person who really owns it.
Thank you,
Patricia Maloney.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Balch and Katie Howell for coming up with and organizing Science Week here at Texas Tech. They're certainly both known for their ingenuity and creativity in programming, and I'm very grateful to be included today. I was especially interested in hearing Dr. Deere's talk last night, interrogating the concept of the scientific revolutions, plural, and look forward to his comments or questions today. For most people, the word scientist and Science Week evoke images of someone in a lab, wearing a white coat, and doing something with pipettes very late at night. It's a lot of caffeine involved. Well, I'm a scientist, but I am a social scientist. Indeed, I'm a sociologist. So I don't even have a lab like some of my psychologist colleagues do. Instead of petri dishes, I have field notebooks. Instead of microscopes or lasers, I have audio recorders. Even worse, I'm a qualitative sociologist, so I can't even use the facade of numbers to try and gain legitimacy from the somewhat similar statistical tests that my quantitative colleagues and friends do. I don't use the positivistic language of p-values or confidence intervals or even deductivist logics of inquiry. That is, I spend a lot of time talking with people. Please note, not two. Yet, as you heard me say before, I overtly claim the title of scientist. My basis for that claim is actually somewhat controversial, given the history of social science research, particularly in America. So let's talk about that history for a second. My poor theory and research methods students have had this beaten into their heads, so I hope they'll put up with a brief reiteration here. While I don't think there's one time point or place that anyone could point to as the start of social research, since humans have always studied each other for both survival and recreational purposes, one bright line that we use in sociology for the formalization of the discipline is Auguste Comte. Monsieur Comte was a philosopher of science, as he called himself, who was fascinated by the different branches of science and their interrelationships. In 1830, in fact, he was the first to coin the term sociology. One of the main reasons that we study, and I mentioned Comte here, is his magnum opus, translated and indeed improved into English by Harriet Martineau as the course in positive philosophy, in which he set out the doctrine of positivism. So what is positivism? To be clear, it has nothing to do with being good or feeling positive about something. Rather, positivism is a scientific philosophy and logic of inquiry that is based on the evidence of one's senses. That is, all data must be based on facts verifiable by empirical, testable data. The etymology of this word is quite interesting. I'd like to draw your attention to it. It's from the Latin positivus, which means that someone has learned something through experience. This is akin to me saying today that I absolutely positively know something because I've experienced or felt it myself. So I could positively know there are 50 people in this room because I could count and verify each one of you. However, asking the question how you're feeling, there's no way for me to positivistically verify that you're feeling happy today. Back to Comte. More than just developing and recommending this positivistic language of inquiry, as a philosopher of science, Comte was fascinated by what I see as 4 things. First, what the different branches of science are and how they differ from one another. Second, how one grew from another. Third, what the evolution of science was over time. And fourth, where science and indeed society could be predicted to go in the future. For Comte, there were 6 distinct branches of science: mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and sociology, or as Comte called it, social physics, which there's a lot to be learned from that name in and of itself. Well, I should say that math was sort of a science. With apologies to any mathematicians present, it was less a science and more a foundational way of thinking and codifying the world, to Comte. And indeed, this was their order. Mathematics had to be established before astronomy, so as best be able to calculate trajectories of stars, etc. Then physics established natural laws through observation of those stellar bodies. Chemistry was in turn applying those natural laws to chemicals, and biology was utilizing those chemical observations in an anatomical sense. Sociology, or social physics, he noted, would not be able to be established without the prior, since it implicitly encompasses each of the former named disciplines. Thus, in moving from mathematics to sociology, one's observations must, by their nature, grow more complex and nuanced. This is why he referred to sociology and boost our ego considerably with the term the queen of the sciences, since he saw it as the most complex and able to affect society if mastered properly. Thus, the positivistic society, or indeed the positivistic ideal person, would need to understand the logic of those prior disciplines to be able to accurately embrace the complexity of social physics. This general sense of evolution, some would say teleological sense, and to be clear, I am one of those who say teleological sense, can also be found in Comte's theory of how a society does and should progress over time. That is, Comte is famous for his law of 3 stages, that both a society, and in his writings he makes clear an individual, must pass through in order to become enlightened. First, societies must rely upon the theological to give themselves order and meaning. That is, meaning and evidence are based upon the natural laws set by God. So any deviation from those laws is because God has willed it. To be clear, there's also an order within the theological stage. First, humans are what's known as fetish-based, then polytheistic, and then monotheistic. To give some concrete examples here. Everybody knows what a rain stick is, the thing that you turn and it makes the sound like rain? Yes. This would be like a fetish for Comte, because you use the object to summon the rain. It is the thing that you use. Then it starts to become more abstract. You have a god of rain that you pray to or sacrifice to in order to help the crops grow. And then finally, you have an overall god, a monotheistic god, that you pray to in order to help your entire life, including said crops that are quite necessary. In a historical sense, Comte saw this theological stage as a very long stage in human history. Indeed, he saw almost all of the world before the French Revolution in the late 18th century, and the Enlightenment as falling into this stage. The second stage, as you can see here, following the first of the theological, is what's known as the metaphysical stage. With the Western Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, came thinkers who moved away from religion and God as the source of natural order, and instead pointed to an abstract force or personified abstraction as the source of order. So another way to think about this is, before the Enlightenment, you prayed your problems away. After the Enlightenment, you were supposed to have thought your problems away. This is a bit hard to grasp. What does it mean to have an abstract force or personified abstraction? So one of the best examples that I've found for this is karma. I'm sure everybody has heard of the term karma before. We think of karma as a universal force, right? A way that the universe has of punishing the wicked and rewarding the just. It's a way of making sense of the world that doesn't involve God. But since it does not involve a deity, Comte saw this stage as more evolved than the theological stage. This, in Comte's thinking, was a transitional stage, a way of preparing the world for the last and most evolved stage, the positivistic stage. I'll use Comte's words to define the positivistic stage. In the final, the positive state, the mind is given over the vain search after absolute notions, the origin and destination of the universe, and the causes of phenomena, and applies itself to the study of their laws. Reason and observation, duly combined, are the means of this knowledge. Okay, there's a lot going on there. Let's break this down a little bit. Here he points to positivism as the acceptance of the abstract and ambiguous, rather than the absolute. Rather than what he terms a vain search for causality of why we are here, instead we should study what the natural laws are for a better order of the universe. In short, he points to the how, not the why. Has this ever happened? Have we ever seen a society that took seriously and embraced the concept of positivism as a governing force? I'm sure many of you know Brazil's flag. Many of the founding leaders and intellectuals of Brazil embraced the tenets of positivism a la Comte because of positivism's abolitionist and democratic tendencies, bent, if you will. In such a positivistic society, Comte noted, a religion of humanity would come about to fulfill the population's need for collective effervescence, as Durkheim would call it. Here, you can see a picture of a positivistic temple in Brazil. You might not be able to see all the details, so I'll shut the light off for just a second. You can see in the top here a motto. Now, you'll forgive me, my Portuguese is horrible, so I'm going to do the English thing. In Portuguese, this says, love by principle, order by base, and progress as the end. And over the three doors, you can see the three central tenets of positivism. The first one, vivere as claris, translates to live in the open. The middle, vivere para outrum, live for others. And finally, the last one, I'm sure you can see it's order and progress. So overall, I'm sure that you can see within positivism that there is a call for lessening of chaos. A move from polytheism to monotheism, a move from religion to metaphysical law, and a move from metaphysical law to positivistic or empirical and scientific law. This indeed, I would argue, undergirds all scientific thought for Comte, the notion that evolution of thought leads to an overarching unification of thought. If people use the tools of rationality and reason to make sense of the world, then they should logically reach the same-ish conclusions. After all, this is the scientific method that you learned in school, right? That we use the logic of inquiry. You form a hypothesis, you test it methodically, you explain to others how you tested it, and you let everybody else replicate it for support. Thus, we should all reach similar conclusions, right? So in a nutshell, that's positivism. That's the foundation of sociology and indeed social research in the Western world especially. To gracefully, or perhaps not so gracefully, depending on your perspective, allied over about 200 years, today, we generally refer to this as a deductivist method, in which the scientist predetermines what should be tested when collecting data. Then she uses that data to determine whether a null hypothesis can be disproved, you know the drill. But my claim to be a scientist rests neither on content nor on deductivist-based scientific method. I don't always test hypotheses in collecting data. I use what's commonly known as an inductivist model, in which I go into a specified social situation and let the data tell me what's happening. The advantage of this is, of course, authenticity. I can be surprised, in short. I'm not bound by the preconceptions or strictures of the more deductivist method, and many refer to what I do as an anti-positivistic positivist way of thinking, or an understanding that social knowledge goes beyond that which can be tested via the senses. The example that I mentioned before about asking how you're feeling, that's a question based in anti-positivist thinking. Stay with me now for the next paragraph. I'm going somewhere with it, okay? Has anybody ever read Terry Pratchett or the Discworld series? Okay. In this series, it's a fantasy series set in a place called the Discworld that has wizards and witches and improbable luggage with lots of feet that follows you around on holidays, which would be quite convenient, I would say. It also has a character known as Death, with the traditional sickle and black cloak and skeleton. You know exactly what I'm talking about, I'm sure. Death has an unusual soft spot for humans in this series. In the slide I'm about to show you, Death is speaking to his granddaughter, Susan, about the nature of humanity. All right, said Susan, I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable. No, humans need fantasies to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies, hogfathers, little, yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies, so we can believe the big ones. Yes, justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sift through it, the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, Death waved a hand, and yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Yes, but people have got to believe that. Or what's the point? My point is that. I'd like to call your attention, particularly to Death's penultimate statement about the little lies that humans need to believe. Justice, mercy, duty. That statement is, for me, the encapsulation of anti-positivism. Neither justice nor mercy, or to put it in more sociological terms, norms and attitudes, can be found in the proverbial sieve of the positivistic senses. Yet I argue that these are social forces that are not only strong and real, but are the very foundation of our existence as humans in society. Comte would perhaps roll over in his grave if he heard me say this, but could we not refer to the understanding of these social forces as the real top of the pyramid? No, I don't think that's true, actually. I hope you'll forgive my amateurish depiction here. There is a reason I'm a professor and not a graphic designer. I think it's more accurate to say that these ineffable but powerful social forces provide the background and the playing field to the pyramid itself, shaping the choices of humans who work these sciences and engage the imagination of billions who are affected by them. So what is the history of such a logic of inquiry? Theoretically speaking, we usually point to Weber and Simmel as some of the first anti-positivist sociologists. However, in practice, I, like Gary Allen Fine, trace it to the first and second Chicago schools, located at, you guessed it, the University of Chicago, in the 1920s and 30s, respectively. This is generally where we place the discovery, some would say invention, of social ethnographic methods in sociology. In the first Chicago school, up here, you find people like Mead, Hughes, Park, people who started thinking about how society enters the mind and shapes the individual's thoughts and thus behaviors. Instead of the more Durkheimian positivistic methods of collecting quantitative data about, for example, suicides, these sociologists gathered their graduate students, assigned them different areas in Chicago to go to and study. This is why the Chicago school is sometimes termed the ecological school or the ecological model. These researchers weren't just interested in the individual in isolation as he or she would appear on a survey or a database. Rather, they were interested in his or her social setting, including interactions between people and interactions between the person's environment and him or herself. Such a study encompasses not just the place in which people live, but the social space they inhabit. World War II heralded the end of the first Chicago school for many, many reasons, including the fact that the war increased America's attention on computer-based technologies that led to the modernist space age of the 1950s. However, the tumultuous years of the 1960s and emphasis on understanding the needs and local social spaces of individuals led to the rise of the second Chicago school, right here. I don't think it's an accident that that phrase, the personal is political, originated in this time period. In the second Chicago school, you find people like Bloomer, Becker, and Goffman, who, despite his dour look, is actually quite a fun guy, I promise. Individuals who focus on symbolic interactionism and understanding the social norms that cause different behaviors. In a famous example, Goffman, the guy in the middle there, had himself committed to a mental hospital for a few months without the knowledge of doctors or nurses who assumed he was mentally ill himself. Because if you want to learn about social norms, where better to go than the place where they're broken, right? Unfortunately, he had a little bit of trouble getting out after he felt his fieldwork was concluded, because protestations that he was a social scientist fell on, shall we say, deaf ears. Finally, his professors and colleagues eventually figured out what had happened to him and came to break him out, figuratively speaking. Well, I'll of course get to the downsides of this method. Let me give you an example of a discovery that I could never have made without this methodological framework. About 5 years ago, I did thousands of hours of fieldwork with new teachers at low-income schools through a program called Teach for America. The nice thing about this program from a sociological standpoint is the cohort effect, meaning they select their what they call core members at the same time, train them in central locations in the same ways, and send them into certain selected schools in the same geographic region. It makes for a fabulous social science question. What happens when you take teachers, select them in the same way, for the same characteristics, train them in the same way, but put them in wildly different school settings? In other words, what are the effects of schools on teachers? Obviously, there are effects. It has a lot to do with the type of administrative support they receive, as well as the development of a socio-professional network. Learn more, see my CV. That's not actually what I want you to focus on today. Rather, it was something that someone said to me in a really offhand manner while I was conducting that fieldwork. And of course, the principal changes the answers when they hand them in, so our scores don't go down. Sometimes I know that it's cheating, but others call it helping the kids. So I'm not sure of it myself. Does it even matter? Why can't it be both? This teacher is, of course, talking about cheating on standardized tests. I had a really hard time keeping a poker face after that one. This is not just because cheating is certainly an unusual behavior for adults. That would obviously come with severe consequences, right, if they were discovered. But the teacher just kind of like dropped that bomb in the middle of us cleaning up her classroom after our class had gone crazy. Where did that come from? And of course, the part of my brain that cares about research and publications went jackpot, right? So what are the implications here, right? Not only that cheating is happening on standardized tests, but adults are doing it, and they're willing to tell me how they're doing it. So I used my existing rapport with teachers in various schools in different states to start asking questions. This is not new news. We know that adults are cheating. The quantitative deductivist research can tell us that. This is, by the way, one of the great strengths of the deductivist method. They can test hypotheses, look at large amounts of data, find numerical patterns, and replicate them in multiple places and by other scientists. They do super well with the what questions in ways that I just can't, given my methods. However, it's almost impossible to answer the how or the why questions conclusively with the deductivist positivist research the same way that I can. Why is this? Part of this is method of data collection. I go around and listen to people so they can tell me their words, their actual words, and their answers. Part of it is social skills, the rapport that I can develop with people over time so they trust me with their secrets. In the case of those teachers, secrets that are not only professionally dangerous, but could be personally devastating if revealed, since cheating on those tests is a felony. So let's share some of the secrets. And of course, I've changed names and identifying characteristics on the slides for obvious reasons. So how does cheating happen? To put a mild form of organization on it, we see it before, during, and after standardized tests. Before the tests, administrators usually can gain access to sealed boxes, etc., and give at least the specified topics, if not particular questions, to teachers. in order to prep the students for a particular test. During the test, it could be something as individual as a teacher walking around and telling a kid, hey, rethink number 12. Or it could be overt as changing behavioral posters. I specify behavioral posters because academic posters, like how to write an essay, whatever, have to be taken down during tests. But behavioral posters that are teacher created do not have to be taken down. Major oversight, since been corrected. So teachers could have a poster up that, for example, says, first, see me if you have a problem. Second, be a good person. I'm sure you get it. Yeah, right? And after the test, it's normally administrators erasing particular answers and putting in correct ones on selected scantrons. So why did they do this? What's the motivation here? While I don't have time to go over all the answers to that question, I do want to point out two in particular that surprised me. This couldn't have been found through deductivist logic. First, what I'm terming social justice motivations. Teachers say that they're cheating because they don't think the tests are fair to their students. So why should their students suffer consequences from their tests? Look, these tests are bullshit. You know that, I know that, hell, even the students know that. They are not made for black kids. They are made for white suburban kids who don't have to deal with what my kids deal with. The tests determine where they go to school, and that can mean life or death. You know how shit this school is. I'm not letting school hurt them. And the next quotation, which is possibly the best thing a respondent has ever said to me in my entire career. Right, okay, so what is the respondent saying here? Like, I have taken sociology classes in school. I know these things are biased. Why would I let inaccurate bias metrics hurt my children? Right, it actually makes perfect sense. There's a perfect logic there. Of course, teachers have concerns about the test's accuracy, student performance. So me helping the kids is actually giving a more right idea of what's going on here, right? Because they don't see the test as accurate measures of what the kids are learning. And of course, they have concerns about being held responsible for the students' performance on these tests. Since the beginning of school, I've only had the same 10 kids stay with me. I've had nearly 200 kids cycle in and out of my class, some of whom arrived 2 days before the exam. How is it I should be held responsible for them? This is a good point. Why should that teacher be held responsible for a child she only got 2 days prior to a test? Why not help herself and the students out at the same time? While I don't have time to go over the full findings of this study, we can see that cheating clusters in schools happens when teachers feel threatened and can happen in myriad ways. I hope to add to the existing deductivist literature that says that this happens, but not how or why. Okay, let me call your attention to something that almost all of you did about 5 minutes ago. You didn't know you were going to be a part of this talk, huh? When I said I changed names, etc., so that no one could replicate my work or identify teachers, most of you did some version of this, right? And you probably thought, like, yeah, of course she's protecting them, right? It makes perfect sense, okay? I don't have any codified law or legal right to protect criminal behavior. I don't. There's no doctor-patient confidentiality in social research. I'm not that type of doctor. There are, of course, confidentiality certificates you can apply for from NIH that have limited utility, and codes of professional ethics that researchers are supposed to obey that include protecting researcher identities, but there's nothing legally binding in there. Theoretically, someone could subpoena my field notes. Now, of course, I took basic precautions like not specifying which states different teachers came from, so as not to give probable cause to some state prosecutor, and wrote my field notes in a code known only to myself, but someone could still compel me to testify from my memories. I could refuse to answer questions, be jailed for contempt, and never have to buy myself a drink at a conference again in my life. But no one asks. No one's ever asked me this. And the statute of limitations is over, so no one ever will. Overall, I think it's extremely rare for a social scientist to be subpoenaed for his or her data, when compared with the sheer number of illegal or unethical activities my colleagues and I observe. It is, of course, impossible for me to offer exact statistics as to the proportion of illegal activities. observed to those subpoenaed for obvious reasons of reporting bias. But I can only think of a handful of times that anyone has ever been threatened with this over the past 30 years. Indeed, one of the most famous cases of a researcher actually allegedly doing something illegal herself, which I'll describe in just a second, was completely ignored by the criminal justice system despite more than 200 newspaper articles accusing her of that fact. Accusing her of not just gathering respondents' recollections of illegal behavior, which of course is hearsay, but actively aiding and abetting it herself. I'm speaking, of course, of Alice Kaufman's work on low-income black men in Philadelphia and how they cope with what she calls over-policing and a surveillance-based culture. I refer you both to the really fascinating and well-written book, On the Run, as well as the numerous reviews written about it for more details, but this book has been the talk of the sociological world since its publication. And more to the point of this talk, I'd like to call your attention to the last section, in which Dr. Goffman, who is, by the way, related to that Goffman guy in the mental hospital, she's his daughter, writes about her actions after her primary informant and, by this point in the book, friend of many years, Chuck, has been killed by a gunshot by a rival gang. Here is the excerpt from the book that's attracted so much attention. To be clear, it's not a full excerpt. I selected certain sentences for purposes of time. Many nights, Steve and Mike drove around looking for the shooter, the guys who were part of his crew, or women connected to them who might be able to provide a good lead. On a few of those nights, Mike had nobody to ride along with him, so I volunteered. We started off around 3 a.m. with Mike in the passenger seat, his hand on his Glock as he directed me around the area. One night, Mike thought he saw a 4th Street guy walk into a Chinese restaurant. He tucked his gun in his jeans, got out of the car, and hid in the adjacent alleyway. I waited in the car with the engine running, ready to speed off as soon as Mike ran back and got inside the car. But when the man came out with his food, Mike seemed to think this wasn't the man he thought it was. He walked back to the car, and we drove on. During the period surrounding Chuck's death, I started studying shootouts in earnest, how and when they happened, and what the ongoing conflicts looked like over time. But I don't believe I got into the car with Mike because I wanted to learn firsthand about violence, or even because I wanted to prove myself loyal or brave. I got into the car because, like Mike and Reggie, I wanted Chuck's killer to die. I'm sure you can see the portions that excited such interest. The uproar over this, caused mainly by non-sociologists, led to an examination of the factuality and validity of the rest of the book by multiple journalists and legal scholars, including a book by Lubin called Interrogating Ethnography, published very recently, about a month or so ago. In this book, Lubin analyzes about 10 to 15 modern and classical pieces of qualitative research, including many ethnographies, for their factual proof, and thus he argues their validity. Through fact-checking various discrete pieces of information in the book, including assertions that police use hospital visitor logs to find people with outstanding warrants, cross-referencing murders mentioned in the book with newspaper articles, and finding other such inconsistencies, Lubin raises questions as to the accuracy of the book's proof, and therefore the validity of the theoretical assertions contained therein. This leads me back to the central theme of this talk that I've been dancing with for the last half an hour or so. What is the nature of proof in sociology? What is its utility? Indeed, to answer those questions, I first have to establish what proof is in sociology, specifically qualitative sociology that I do. I assert that qualitative sociological proof is a preponderance of evidence that leads a researcher to be able to describe in detail and accurately the social and causal mechanisms in a given social situation. This theoretical description must be able to stand up to scrutiny from other researchers and the respondents, and it must have been formulated and edited in response to counterfactual evidence. Counterfactual evidence is those inconvenient observations that don't quite fit with one's initial theories. It should consist of a respondent's words, actions, body language, and social setting, as well as the researcher's self-reflexive recording of the biases and social lens. You see here that I'm calling for what I term a proof of concept, not proof of a given event. This, of course, puts me at odds with Lubin, who are used to being able to, legal scholars like Lubin, who are used to being able to call upon witnesses and documentation to prove a given event, and thus any theory or conclusions based on that event. These are scholars who I see as wanting not a proof of concept, but rather a proof of event. Indeed, I don't think qualitative research should or could be used to prove a given event, given our ethical directive to change names, identifying details, etc. In fact, I would argue that ethnography is at times counter to this very legalistic ethos of wanting to prove that person X was at place Y at time Z. My disposition towards a proof of concept also places me somewhat at odds with my quantitative colleagues, who generally rely upon respondents' self-classifications of their own attitudes or experiences into numbers on surveys. Then they use agreed-upon tests and metrics of statistical significance to determine if their hypotheses are accurate. That is, the community of scholars comes together to decide what proof is for them. For lack of a better phrase, I call this community-based proof of correlation, because it's claimed that there is a relationship between variables is based on community-decided finish lines, like a p-value of 0.05. These finish lines, let me add, are socially constructed. Why 0.05 and not 0.06, 0.04? Because we as a society like numbers that end in 5 or 10 or 0. There is, by the way, a literature in sociology that studies such epistemological questions. Much of this can be traced back to R.A. Fisher's 1925 book that set the proverbial p-value finish line at 0.05 because, and I quote here, it is convenient to draw the line at about the level at which we say either there is something in the treatment or a coincidence has occurred such as does not occur more than once in 20 trials. As he notes, it's convenient, not necessarily objectively correct. So now I've added a third type of proof. We started with proof of concept, which tends to be qualitative and based on refinement of theory through observation. Then moved to proof of event, which is based on being able to show to others that a given event or phenomenon has occurred. And finally, proof of correlation, which is based on how generally self-reported variables vary together and is determined by community standards. So which is sociological proof? What's necessary to support thoroughly an assertion in social research? Well, let's tie things together now and go back to my initial monologue that you were also kind to sit through about positivism and anti-positivism. For positivism, proof of event and correlation are not mutually exclusive, but they're also not synonymous. That is, deductivist quantitative social research rarely relies on individuals experiencing the same event at the same time in the same place, instead correctly recognizing that humans' lives are meandering and chaotic and individualistic. So it's better to account for time asynchronicity through respondent recollection and other such sorting mechanisms. But it's theoretically possible that a quantitative sociologist would want to survey or measure everyone who experienced a certain discrete event, and would thus need to prove that his or her sample experienced at that event. So I don't think that these two logics of proofs are necessarily at odds with one another, but they're also not necessarily the same. This then leads us to the relationship between proof of concept and proof of correlation. I don't see these at odds necessarily. There's a very trite saying about working together to triangulate a better picture of the social world that is often overused, but honestly it's true. I think they can work in concert. As I mentioned before, I do think that ethnographic proof of concept and legalistic proof of event are at odds. You have no proof, you as people, have no proof that those teachers said those things. I could be lying. I and my colleagues have two rather meager defenses against such an accusation. My personal research honor, that I tell the truth, right? Perhaps more importantly, secondly, I have your own understanding of the world. It makes sense to you that teachers and administrators could cheat on exams because not only of your own experience, maybe you have personally seen it happen, or you've seen teachers be under immense stress and can imagine it happening, or you've seen stories in the newspapers. Thus, my account, while novel, jives with your understanding of the world. I have proof of concept because you accept the stories that I'm telling you rather than me having to prove that at such and such a time, such and such a teacher did X. So the simple fact that you nodded along and accepted my stories before means that you, at some level, agree with me about proof of concept. Thus ends my ramblings about the nature and utility of proof in sociology. I hope that you can see how the strains of positivism and anti-positivism inform sociology today, as well as the social research that my colleagues and I enjoy. Questions?
So kind of going from the beginning of your speech to the end, you talked a lot about collective effervescence, and I wondered if when we enter those small schools where they're all really tied together as a community, how impactful could collective effervescence be when a teacher decides to help their children pass or get through the standardized test?
Extremely so. I don't remember if I mentioned this or not, but I did find that cheating clusters in schools. You're either in a cheating school or a not cheating school. Rarely was there one lone ranger, if you will, who cheated when the rest of the school did not. A lot of this was because of that collective effervescence, and a lot of it was also because it was a permission sort of thing. If all the teachers around you were doing this, well, yeah, of course you're going to do it too, right? Because your numbers are going to look really bad otherwise, right? So you're going to need that sort of thing. So yeah, I did find that this sort of thing clusters, which also jives with what the quantitative people found.
Would you say that qualitative methods and basic journalistic practices have a lot in common, and that could probably mend relations between public and sociology?
No. A lot of the people who criticized Dr. Alice Goffman's work were journalists and wanted to be able to find that proof of event that Dr. Goffman, because of ethical reasons, did not feel she could provide. So while I don't necessarily think that ethnography and journalism have to be at odds with one another, nor do I see them as the same thing. We have different ethical and methodological practices, which is a good thing, right? Better to have different lenses on the same social problem.
I see a parallel in what you've said to something I carry around in my head and have for some time. There's a historic record of what is factually accurate about the Civil War, and we have numbers and all that kind of stuff that goes with that. We also have Margaret Mitchell's book, Dawn of the Wind. That is another way of characterizing and capturing what happened during that time period in America. Would it be accurate to say that quantitative research gives us things that are factually accurate, and qualitative research shows us things that we know to be sort of viscerally true? There's a level, there's an immeasurable truth that transcends this. Is that sort of, that work?
Yeah, I think so. People like stories, right? There's a reason there's a lot of parables are so common in different holy books of different faiths, because people learn through stories. And for a lot of people, particularly those who, for whatever reason, have not enjoyed higher levels of education, will learn and remember better through stories. And by the way, I put myself and indeed my students in that. I teach by telling stories. You will remember the story about Goffman in the mental asylum, right? You may not necessarily remember me talking about deductivist, inductivist, blah, 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 right? But you'll remember that story, okay? So yeah.
But then proof at the end of the day becomes what seems viscerally true. There's a level of subjectivity that goes with that, but it's also what informs our own decision.
Sure, right? I mean, the slide about the social forces affecting everything else. Scientists are human. They are absolutely affected by the social forces outside them. In the best of worlds, I would hope that ethnographers serve as the proverbial Socratic gadfly to the rest of society, saying what is inconvenient and providing that little nudge that maybe the way we do things is not fair, is not equal, is not just. Now, I sound a bit like a missionary there, but I'm betraying myself.
You mentioned the word sociological science. What's the difference to sociology?
No. So you mean social research versus sociology?
Well, social sciences, I think, is a more recent.
Oh, yes, okay, so sorry, I couldn't hear you. Yeah, so social science I see as encompassing not just sociology, but political science, anthropology, some areas of economics. So as I see social science research as a much more umbrella term that sociology falls
But
under.
you use the term in your own discipline, don't you?
Social physics?
It's like no science.
We see ourselves as
You don't
social
just say
scientists.
that you're doing sociology.
I would generally say I'm doing sociology.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about those who accept social sciences as a science versus those who don't. And when we're talking about those, do you see that there's any point in the future where people will accept that even though they have never experienced those events that give them that proof of concept, that possibly they would categorize us with science versus as just a social science?
Yeah, it's the question that a lot of my colleagues and I are frankly probably sick of hearing is sociology a science or an art, right? And there are intradiscipline feuds about that would take me hours and hours to cover. I don't think that they're necessarily at odds with one another, to give you my answer. And I think that if you think back to the slide where I talked about how social forces affect all other sciences, people who like to call themselves pure, that's nice, honey. I don't agree. Okay. I do want to make sure that we have time for Dr. Deere's comments.
Oh, you don't have to worry about that.
Okay. Would you like a minute?
No, that's fine. I can make some mutterings, but not much, because whoops, I can't claim to have any great profound insights on this. One thing that I would note, and that I'm very happy to note, is that in effect what you're saying is that certain approaches in sociology and in other social sciences for that matter, don't need to be called sciences to be worth doing. I mean, you wanted to characterize sociology, or your kind of sociology, as scientific. I take it that the reason to do that is because this raises the status of what you're doing to real knowledge rather than just making up stories.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah. And I think that's important. That's not a put down. It's an important point. The word science is so much of a magic word used to lend value to the thing that's so described. And I think this is a good indication of how you can make knowledge without making strong claims about how this is real science according to some kind of abstract definition of what science really is. To go back to the 19th century and sociology and so on, mentioning Comte and talking about social physics. Of course, social physics was a term invented by Adolphe Quetelet in the 1830s. He was actually an astronomer and a mathematician, and he thought that you could develop a physics of society by applying mathematical techniques, error curves and looking at large numbers and things of that sort, so that you could develop laws of society that would be rooted in actual numbers and in data. And because that was the case, he liked to call it social physics, with an implication that this was, as it were, real science. And the association of some brands of sociology with numerical work that made them properly scientific is something that continues to the present day very much, p-values and all that. And was certainly a part of the development of modern sociology. I think late 19th century Chicago sociology was very much focused on counting things and having numbers and things like that. Again, because it lends credibility and status to the knowledge enterprise that's so labeled. Call it a science and it sounds more serious. That doesn't mean, though, that there is some scientific technique that you apply to raw material to come out with scientific facts. I think that's illustrated the sort of thing going on here. There is science in a kind of strong sense, which would be one that followed formal rules and perhaps was mathematical. There is the use of science in a loose sense to refer to a knowledge enterprise, to refer to the making of knowledge, and you call it science. Why not? You know, history, serious work, historical work, is a science, particularly if you're a German, it counts as a science. Any disciplined body of knowledge, including the knowledge of law or something, can be called a science, even if it doesn't look much like physics, let's say, or whatever other model of quantitative science you might want to use. It's all about the pragmatics of argument, and if you can persuade people that what you're saying is legitimate and creates things that you can accept as true, then that's good enough. What more could you want? It's all about persuasion. It's always all about persuasion. So whatever it takes to persuade people of a knowledge claim does the job. And it doesn't matter whether you call it science or not, although sometimes simply calling it science might help you to persuade people. But there's nothing magic about the word. I think that's really all I have to say about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
some methods of persuasion are better than others. Yes.
Certainly.
So methods can be critiqued.
I think one's scientific and persuasive methods, which I see as different, certainly can be critiqued. Yeah. Particularly, you can critique them for their use in a given situation, their appropriateness.
So there's this book called Sociology and its Publics, which talks about how the relations of sociology to the public have evolved since the 19th century. So one thing it clarifies is a Don Mill text starting around the 60s or 70s that leads to a decline in relations with publics, and I was just wondering if you remember what that event was.
Off the top of my head now, I know that Michael Burrow has a whole series of articles and talks about what he terms public sociology. So if I had to look for what that cause was, I'd probably go there first. I saw another hand.
No, are we out of time?
My class is over, but I can stay again. Yeah.
How do you overcome someone rejecting your proof of concept, or whether it conflicts with them? How do you overcome the demand for numbers?
This is something that my colleagues and I talk a lot about, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to just point to, again, as I said before, the preponderance of the evidence, and just keep on doing what you're doing.
Which is a nice legalistic experiment.
Yeah, it is. I wondered if anyone was going to catch that. Was it?
So when we talk about proof and proving, one side of this relationship is dialect, is sociologist, and another part is the audience.
Sure.
So I want to know your opinion about the types of audience of sociology or sociological knowledge in U.S. today. And what effect they have on the sort of proof that is more popular in the academy.
Sure, right. So I write very differently for an academic audience as opposed to a lay audience, as opposed to a governmental audience. And I don't think any apologies need to be made for that fact. That's just writing for your audience. Different groups like different proofs. If I'm writing for governmental, they dearly love themselves from statistical tests. And I can deliver that when necessary. But normally I'm brought onto the team as an assessment person, right? The person who decides how we gather proof.
My question is about proof of concept, kind of in reference to the way I'm thinking about it is Alice Kaufman's ethnography. She makes an assertion that this is how the black men that she interacts with react to over-policing. But my question is, how can that assertion be made? Like, if her accounts aren't proven, how can that assertion be made? Because I understand proof of concept, how that makes sense that that would happen, but how can that become a concrete theory if we don't know that the reactions she accounts are true or happen?
Sure. So part of it is looking at that science is not a solitary event. We look at what other people are doing, both qualitative and quantitative, to see if it fits with the picture of the world, or at least sort of fits with the picture of the world that they're providing. And a lot of time we also look for other pieces of evidence, like how black men are treated in the criminal justice system, right? There's a ton of proof about racism and its effects on black men. So part of it is, again, as we said before, the rather meager defense of personal honor, and part of it is, does it fit with the rest of what we know? Yeah, does it move science forward that incremental inch? Other questions? Okay, well, thank you for sticking around. Good to see all of you.